Hello and welcome to the Stoner Story Witch podcast. My name is Kristyn and it is a pleasure to have you listening today. This episode is, I suppose, the closest thing that I have to a pilot, but as it will be clear shortly, I am still not entirely sure the direction that this podcast is going to take. So this is kind of the work in progress pilot episode where I give a little bit of backstory to who I am and where I am, and more than anything, just explain the name of the podcast and where it comes from. And I guess I also just want to name that it is really scary to me to be at the point where I am editing the podcast and putting down a little intro that I don't have a pilot. I don't entirely have my vision statement or values totally listed out in a way that I feel confident isn't going to change. And I think I also just want to normalize that sometimes we can do things without really understanding why. And for me, this is an exercise in releasing some perfectionism and just following that next step because it feels like it's where I need to go and not because I even know where I'm going. And if that sounds like something you're interested in hearing more about, I invite you to listen. And the next few episodes in this season are going to be specifically applying my Stoner Story Witch lens to the story of the 2019 Little Women movie. So if you just want to jump ahead to those, I will not be talking about that in this episode. This is, like I said, I think I'll kind of title it my episode 0, What's in a Name? So without any further ado, this is me diving into who I am and what I'm about, and what this podcast is hoping to offer. I hope you enjoy, and I am sincerely grateful to have you stumble upon my podcast and be giving it a listen. I really have no idea what this is going to turn into exactly. I have thoughts, maybe sometimes they seem like visions or fantasies or dreams of where it might go, but this truly is a documenting of a journey that I've been on for over 3 years now. And I can't find my next breadcrumb until I accomplish this task. That for 3 years I have been wanting to, that feels not right to say that I've been wanting to, but I have been called to be outspoken about my use of cannabis. It started about 3 years ago. I had realized that I had a very interesting relationship with cannabis. It seemed like, honestly, the most similar I can equate it to is when I was in my teen years. My dad was killed by a drunk driver when I was 12, and my coping was through church and finding some sort of meaning through spirituality. And the only access to spirituality that I had as just a white-bodied suburban girl in the Midwest was the Lutheran church in my community. And I'll go into this another time perhaps, but I had some very numinous and spiritual experiences after my dad died that really led me to believe that there's more. There's more. There's some more than human realm. And for several years, I felt that I was in relationship with this archetypal energy that I chalked up to my, like, the Holy Spirit and Jesus and God. And it wasn't until my freshman year, I was taking a history of the Old and New Testament and just really being presented with the history of Christianity, how it all came to be. And then that sparked a whole skepticism, and it kind of made me throw out this part of my spirituality, this relationship with this more than divinity. And for years and years, I was without that connection. And there's more I can say about that time, but all that to say, the pandemic hit, and I found myself in therapy, going through some big things, and I found that I was drawn to ingesting cannabis after a really tough therapy session, and it would help me integrate. Kind of like how you would call upon a friend to help you make sense of some really stressful situation that you're going through in your life. I just would intuitively know I want to write a letter to my children and have my partner read it to me. And that was some healing inner child work before I really did enough therapy and self-healing to understand even like what healing your inner child really was. And for that, I'm so grateful to cannabis as a person. Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about, like more than human persons, or a non-human person. And yeah, for 3 years, cannabis has wanted me to expose myself as someone who is in this deep connection with her. And I was a high school biology teacher, and the opportunity was there. I had students who I know smoked. I wrote about this a little bit in a blog shortly after I ended up quitting, but I wish I had been braver even then to actually say these things to my students and not just on the internet and like maybe hoping that somebody would find it. And I recognized it was really more to myself, like, sorry for the ways that the world punishes us or stigmatizes us for seeking liberation. And for me, that is what cannabis does. The name Stoner Story Witch is one that cannabis gave me when I would just, as I think this podcast will turn into, I think, is me getting stoned, engaging with stories, and putting a witchy lens onto it. It's kind of like an instructional manual of sorts, like step 1, step 2, step 3. And there's more. I can feel that there's more, but I can't find it yet until I do the thing. And cannabis wants to be named in this role of, like, as a co-host of sorts. But yeah, I wanted to have a more nuanced conversation about plant medicine with my students. I recognized the desire. I recognized that it can serve multiple purposes for different people. I know it doesn't have the same effect on everyone. And by no means am I advising that anybody go out and smoke weed, I guess. It's like, and yet if you've been drawn to it, if it has had some like fairy godmother like quality in your life, like you are not alone. Like, I get it. I think for 3 years I sat in shame around what it would be to put my voice out there as in a way that my biology teaching upbringing up until that point, it was unfathomable to do that, to talk about plants from a spiritual component. I'd say, well, that's not science. Like, spirituality needs to be separate from science, and like that is fucking bullshit. I'm feeling a sadness when I think about how capitalism and all the dominating systems of oppression have made it that to be a good scientist, you have to only value rational thought, that which can be repeated and provide evidence and be observable and testable and peer-reviewed, and it's about like figuring out how things work and not marveling, not a practice of experiencing awe at it, but trying to describe it so as to forget, to be in love with life. And so another way I think of the stoner story witch is that it is kind of, because I just know that that's the phrase, stoner story witch. I don't know what it means. I think it is a step 1, step 2, step 3. I also think that they are invitations. To be in question with, how do we connect with our intuition? How do we connect with our wildness? And for me, one of my answers is my relationship with cannabis. That to be a stoner, and it's a word that is, I recognize is used to denigrate pot smokers by the capitalist society that would have us wanting to, like not experience ease and reflection and connection and awe, which is what cannabis does for me, I know. And so it makes sense that that somebody would just write me off as a stoner, and that's their right. But I want to be very clear that when I say stoner, for me, it is a way of remembering what I've been conditioned to forget. And then story is, I can't hardly listen to music or watch a show or a movie without just finding what feels like the cracks that liberation wants to peek through. About 2 years ago, I started an online wilderness quest with one of my teachers, Carmen Spagnola. And one of the prompts that she had us reflect on in the very beginning was, who are your bloodlines, who are your milk lines, and who are your storylines? And so, in other words, it's who are your blood ancestors and other non-related chosen family that had a hand in raising you into who you are. But also, along the storylines, it's what are those prominent stories that raised you into who you are? And just that question alone is making me want to find out where stories are calling us into an unlearning or a more liberated way of being, and not just like consuming it for entertainment value alone. And I think that like we do ourselves a big disservice when we engage in stories on that shallow level of just needing to get through it, rather than actually like sitting in it. And that's a thing. That's a practice that I really enjoy. That I find watching film or reading or TV, somehow engaging in stories or listening to music with cannabis has been a revelatory practice. And I'll say more about this as I go on. And then as far as the witch, so it's like, that feels like the way we resource ourselves for collective liberation. And that's the answer that I feel like witch is, or the question that witch is answering. Feels very related to being a stoner, actually, because it's another kind of derogatory word for a very, for a person that a person in stories, if we think of just, any Disney movie where there's some witch, like, it doesn't take long to sit with that and wonder, like, how did imperialism or white supremacy or capitalism or patriarchy contribute to her trajectory towards being a villain? Like any good kind of backstory, like villain, there's a genre and it's escaping me, but like how villains are made points us to that. And so I think there's like an invitation for being compassionate too, compassionate with where we've been, and I have a strong conviction about like the steps of proceeding towards a liberated future. And yeah, for 3 years I've been compelled to make a podcast, write a blog. I've done little blog pieces here and there. The big story that is coming to me that I really, really, really want to work on is about Hadestown. It's the 2019 Tony Award winning musical written by Anais Mitchell. It is my intention to have a season devoted to Hadestown. And I am not a podcaster. Like, I don't know any of the software. I don't know any of it. Sitting on my floor next to my bed with a yoga mat behind my computer, trying to create as much of, like, I guess, a good sound, because that seems like that. I want this to be pleasant for anybody who might be listening. But man, I feel scared, because I don't feel like I know what I'm doing. There's lots of voices in my head, or sometimes refer it to in hospicing modernity. You say, like, you have this bus, and somebody on my bus is telling me all sorts of things I don't need to repeat here about why I shouldn't be here. And we're not listening to them today. But it's the next breadcrumb, and I have to start somewhere. When I went on my wilderness quest last year, it's coming up on a year actually, I hope to release this podcast on the anniversary of my quest. But I found that I had to adjust my tarp on my second day. That the way I just made my tarp on the first day was not what ended up being what I needed and wanted for the second day. And I noticed that, I wouldn't have been able, I wouldn't have thought to do my day 2 tarp had I not done my day 1. And yet I couldn't just sit and be stuck in analysis mode, trying to figure out day 2 tarp without first just doing the first tarp that was going to just get me through my first night. And this podcast feels like it's my day 1 season. It was what I want for my Hadestown podcast is not, I can't do that yet. I'm not there yet. And instead, I found myself drawn to the 2019 movie rendition of Little Women. And I've planned out 6 episodes that at first I kind of wanted to chat with people and get their take, and I found myself too overwhelmed at the idea of getting on people's schedules and figuring out what are the questions going to be and trying to kind of curate and cultivate what that's going to be. I felt like that was going to be too much, so I'm committing to this being, I guess, more of a pre-season, season 0 of I don't know, a diary. Maybe that's what this podcast is. I don't know, but it's what I'm doing. And so I recognize that this podcast is not, me creating this podcast isn't about making a podcast. It's about the process. What I am creating here is a byproduct of the process of making the podcast. The way that our art actually creates us. A theme that is very alive in Hadestown and in Little Women, which I will get to. And yeah, a thing that just resourced me for this season, for committing to this, was making sourdough, of all things. I moved to Costa Rica this year as well, from Minnesota. So from indigenous native Dakota lands to ancestral Chorotega lands. And I found myself wanting to make sourdough bread. There's so many delicious rice and tortilla-based foods here, and I found myself really craving sourdough, and I got into making it. And what I mean by that is I was terrified to start because I was intimidated. I've never really been a baker. But I found somebody who was willing to kind of show me the ropes, and I told myself on March 1st that I would just make sourdough every day for a month and see how the process of making sourdough every day, just what that does to me. and not only did it get way less like scary and way easier, but I found it quickly actually became a part of like a self-care. Like it's a way that it lends some structure to my day. That kind of became its own little its own little quest within this quest. But I was relating to the sourdough like if I can learn sourdough, I can make this podcast. And I guess part of it not feeling like it's done or like that it's an unfoldment is I wrote a poem about it. And I don't feel like the poem is done. But I read it anyway. There was a poetry event that people were just invited to read, and I had just kind of started. I wanted to just document like what are the lessons that the sourdough is trying to teach me. Like again, if I get stoned and I think, what is the story of my sourdough season? What are the lessons? And I don't know if this is technically a poem. I'm not a poet. But it came to me in more of I don't know, poetic or is this prose? I always have to Google. I think this poem is going to be different in the next month. I think it's likely that more will be added. But it is May 5th. 5:05 p.m. Chorotega time, 2024. And I will leave this recording with me reading my poem as a kind of final intro to the day one season. So they call you sourdough, and they may call me a witch. I have wanted to learn you, know you, make you for years. So deeply nourishing from the hands of others and the disbelief that my hands could make something so delicious and wholesome. Allies appear. Follow the breadcrumbs, receive the gifts. Let the encouragement fuel my desire to get these hands dirty. My dirty hands. My tax dollars funding genocide. Shame visits me on day one. Palestinian children are scooping up spilled flour along dirt roads. Who are you? My shame demands to know as he raises his eyebrows at my sticky, tacky hands. Simply a soft animal, I admit, reaching towards what I care about. Who has to believe that by committing to a small and delicious life, Palestine will be free, and it will free us. I offer my grief to the bricks of my shame and my discomfort to the mortar of my fear. I find the crack in the wall and I break in, or is it out? And also through. Just like the Palestinian kids to Meta's algorithms, they must not be ignored. I honor my heavy heart as I don my apron and proceed as though collective liberation is possible. Because Mars is going to hash it out with Saturn before coming home to Jupiter, and Pluto meets my rising. It's a witch's location in time and space, and her assertion of carpe diem. Commit to my capacity. Vow to the work that I will be in relationship with it, not domination over it. You are not me. You are not mine. We have chosen each other and are in a creative play. A love affair that I can slather with butter and serve at the table of my beloveds. It's so easy to wake with the sun to tend to you. My practice has been to prolong the night, by rolling away and refusing the day and closing my eyes once more. Where can I find ease? What playful experiments will deepen our intimacy? You speak to me crackling out of the oven, and I am listening with ears that can finally hear. I am receptive to your whispers. Persephone guides me to spring with her medicine that helps me to see so that Hades may remember. When I see, modernity will call me a stoner and call Hades successful when he won't. I can nourish myself to create by creating you, teaching me to trust what my creation can provide. I invite you to become my blood, my flesh. I ingest my intentions so I can integrate who I was with who I am becoming. A mystic's holy communion, because I have to hash it out with Christianity before coming home to Jesus, as I thank Dionysus for rising. They may call us a witch. We practice interruption and return. We experiment with playful processes. We employ compassionate systems. We unlearn the lies of modernity as we defy our conditioned fear. To alchemize flour, salt, water, and fire into something so dense and airy, fluffy and crunchy, hard and soft. A middle finger to binary thinking. Just like we alchemize the hopes of our ancestors with prosperity and self-discovery into something so personally satisfying that my community will be fed. The outer change via inner change, a soft compassion for paradox. I commune with you for me, and I delight in offering you with my community. The giveaway is not a transacting exploitation, it's sharing abundance. I define community. They call you sourdough. I call you my guide, my friend, a metaphor for my creativity, which is a metaphor for my liberation, and a portal to a free Palestine. Because what is a story if not a spell for liberation? Modernity will call me a stoner, and you may call me a witch. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I would like to take this opportunity to thank my teachers that I mentioned in this episode, specifically Robin Wall-Kimmerer and her book Braiding Sweetgrass, the book Hospicing Modernity by Vanessa Machado de Oliveira, and my teacher Carmen Spagnola. I will put links to their work in the show notes. I would also like to thank Matt Schubbe for the art for the podcast, and my husband Kevin Carlo for the help in the sound and song of the podcast, as well as I need to shout out to John Williams, who is the creator of Hedwig's theme, as well as Aeneas Mitchell, who wrote Hadestown, because those two works inspired the making of the song for this podcast. Thank you all so much for listening, and the next few episodes will be about Little Women. I invite you to stick around and check them out. And before I sign off, I would like to leave you with a quote from another one of my teachers, Rev. Angel Kyodo Williams, who says, "Love and justice are not two. Without inner change, there can be no outer change. And without collective change, no change matters."